Look at this cucumber plant. Just 3 weeks ago, it was yellow spindly, and I was ready to pull it out of the ground entirely. Now, I cannot even keep up with the harvest. I have given away bags of cucumbers to 3 neighbors, and I am still picking them faster than we can eat them. And no, I did not buy any fancy fertilizer. I did not install a drip system, and I certainly did not spend more than a couple of dollars. The thing that turned this plant around is something you almost certainly have sitting in your kitchen right now. And the reason you have probably never heard about using it this way is honestly kind of annoying. It works too well and costs too little for anyone to make money selling it to you as a garden product. I have been gardening for a good 15 years now, and for most of that time, I had a cucumber problem that drove me absolutely crazy. You probably know exactly what I am talking about. The plants start strong. You get excited. The vines climb, the flowers appear, and then the tiny little cucumbers form and you think, this is the year. And then almost overnight, the bottom leaves start turning yellow. The edges go crispy. The little cucumbers shrivel up and fall off before they are even the size of your pinky finger. And you stand there, hose in hand, completely baffled, wondering what you did wrong. I know that feeling. I know it all too well. I spent years chasing that problem in circles, and I want to tell you exactly what I tried, why every single one of those common fixes failed, and then show you the ridiculously simple thing that finally worked, not just for one season, but every season since. This is not theory. This is what I do now, every 2 weeks, without fail, and it has turned cucumbers from my most frustrating crop into my most reliable one. The problem, at its core, is something that almost every gardener runs into, but very few people actually explain in plain language. Cucumbers are, botanically speaking, divas. They are not like tomatoes, which can muscle through a little neglect and still give you something. Cucumbers have shallow, delicate root systems that are extraordinarily sensitive to soil conditions. When the soil pH drifts too far in either direction, the roots literally cannot absorb nutrients, even if those nutrients are present in abundance. It is like being in a room full of food, but having your mouth sewn shut. The plant starves while sitting in a buffet. And the first sign of that starvation is always the same: yellowing lower leaves, dropped fruit, and a general look of exhaustion. The plant is cannibalizing its oldest leaves to try to feed the growing tips, and it is losing the battle. Now, when most people see yellow leaves on cucumbers, they reach for one of 3 things. The first is nitrogen fertilizer, usually something synthetic and blue, dissolved in a watering can. And here is the thing. Sometimes that actually greens the leaves back up for a few days. But it does not solve the underlying problem, because the underlying problem is not a lack of nitrogen in the soil. It is that the roots cannot access what is already there. So you pour on the blue stuff, you get a temporary flush of green, and then 2 weeks later, you are right back where you started. Only now you have also thrown the soil biology out of balance with a salt-based fertilizer that kills off the beneficial fungi that were actually trying to help your plant. It is like giving a starving person a shot of adrenaline instead of actually feeding them. It looks like it works for a moment, but it makes everything worse. The second thing people try is Epsom salts. And I need to be careful here, because Epsom salts do have a legitimate use in the garden, but not for this. Epsom salts are magnesium sulfate. Magnesium is a secondary nutrient that plants need, yes, but a yellowing cucumber plant is almost never suffering from a simple magnesium deficiency. What happens is that people see a gardening blog recommend Epsom salts, they sprinkle it around, and then when the plant does not improve, they assume they did not use enough and add more. Excess magnesium in the soil actually blocks the uptake of calcium and potassium, which are the 2 nutrients cucumbers need most desperately for fruit development. So you are not just wasting your time. You are actively making the problem worse, locking up the very nutrients the plant is screaming for. The third approach, and this one honestly breaks my heart a little every time I see it, is the vinegar and salt weed killer logic applied to the garden bed. People get so frustrated that they decide to nuke the whole situation. They pour boiling water on the soil to sterilize it, or they drench it with vinegar to lower the pH, not realizing that they are not just killing pathogens, they are killing everything. You kill the weed, but at the same time you kill the soil. It is like curing a headache by cutting off your head. Technically it works, but is it a reasonable solution? You end up with a sterile, lifeless patch of dirt that will not grow anything well for months. And the cucumber plant, if it survives at all, is even weaker than before because its root zone has been chemically scorched. I went through all of these. I made every single one of these mistakes, some of them more than once, because I am stubborn and I kept thinking, well, maybe this time, if I just adjust the concentration slightly. It never worked. And the thing that finally set me on the right path was not a YouTube video or a garden center employee. It was a woman named Mrs. Kowalska, who lived 2 doors down from me for about 8 years before I ever spoke to her beyond waving hello. She had a garden that was frankly obnoxious in how perfect it was. Every summer, her cucumbers would climb these simple wooden trellises and produce so heavily that you could see the vines sagging under the weight of the fruit from the sidewalk. Meanwhile, my cucumber patch, 50 feet away, looked like a sad salad that someone had forgotten in the back of the fridge. One afternoon, I finally swallowed my pride, walked over while she was deadheading her marigolds and asked her, as politely as I could, what her secret was. She looked at me for a long moment, the way someone does when they are deciding whether you are actually ready to hear the answer, and then she said, in her very thick accent, "You are making it too complicated. The plant just needs to breathe and drink properly. Come, I show you." She walked me into her kitchen, not her garden shed. She opened a cabinet above her stove and pulled out a bright orange box that I guarantee you have in your own kitchen right this moment. Plain baking soda. Chemically, sodium hydrogen carbonate. That is the one. The same stuff you put in your fridge to absorb odors, the same stuff you use in a pound cake, the same stuff that costs less than a single coffee from a vending machine. I stood there in her kitchen, holding this box of baking soda, and I will admit, I was skeptical. I had heard of using baking soda as a fungicide spray on leaves. That is a fairly common, organic gardening tip. But she was not talking about spraying the leaves. She was telling me to pour it on the roots. And I know exactly what you might be thinking right now. Probably just another miracle internet trick that does not actually work at all. I completely understand your skepticism. I thought exactly the same thing until I saw with my own eyes what this can do, and more importantly, until I understood why it works. Because once you understand the mechanism, it stops being a mysterious folk remedy and becomes just plain obvious. So let me just show you exactly what to do, and then I will explain the science so that it clicks for you the same way it clicked for me standing in Mrs. Kowalska's kitchen. Here is the recipe. You need 3 things. First, 1 tablespoon of plain baking soda. Do not use baking powder. Baking powder contains added acids and starches, and it is not the same thing. You want pure sodium bicarbonate, the cheapest generic brand you can find. Second, 1 gallon of water. If your tap water is heavily chlorinated, let it sit out overnight in an open container so the chlorine can off-gas, or use rainwater if you collect it. Chlorine is antimicrobial, which is great for drinking water but not great for the beneficial bacteria living around your plant's roots. Third, 1 single drop of liquid Castile soap or plain, unscented dish soap, not antibacterial soap, not anything with fragrances or degreasers. Just the simplest, most boring liquid soap you can find. That is it. 3 ingredients, Total cost for a single application is maybe 15 cents. The soap is not there to clean anything. It acts as a surfactant, which is a fancy word for something that reduces the surface tension of water. You know how when you drip water onto a dusty leaf, it beads up and rolls off instead of spreading out and soaking in. That is surface tension at work. The soap breaks that tension so the solution spreads evenly through the soil and makes full contact with the root surfaces, instead of channeling down a few narrow paths and leaving most of the root zone dry. That one drop of soap is the difference between the baking soda solution actually reaching the roots and just draining uselessly out the bottom of the bed. Mix the tablespoon of baking soda into the gallon of water and stir until it is completely dissolved. You should not see any grains swirling around. Add your single drop of soap and stir gently. You do not want suds. If you see foam, you use too much soap. You want the water to feel just barely slippery between your fingers, nothing more. That is your whole preparation. No protective gear, no precise pH meters, no complicated schedules. Just a gallon of water, a spoonful of baking soda, and a drop of soap. Now the application is where most people get it wrong, and getting it wrong can actually harm your plants, so please listen carefully. You do not pour this solution over the leaves. Leaf application of baking soda is a different technique for a different problem, and if you do it in the sun, you will burn your plants. You pour this directly onto the soil around the base of the plant, soaking the root zone. I use about 1 quart per mature cucumber plant, applied slowly so it soaks in rather than running off. Do this in the early morning or late evening, never in the heat of the day when the sun is beating down and the plant is already stressed. The soil should be moist before you apply. Never apply any root drench, even a gentle one like this, to bone-dry soil. Water your plants normally first, let that soak in for an hour or two, and then apply the baking soda solution. This prevents the roots from being shocked by a sudden change in their environment. Apply this once every 2 weeks during the growing season. Do not be tempted to apply it more often. More is not better. Baking soda is a salt, and while it is a very mild one, over-application can build up sodium in the soil over time, which is exactly what we are trying to avoid. Once every 2 weeks is the rhythm. I mark it on my calendar so I do not forget, and I have been doing it this way for years now without any build-up issues. If you are growing in containers rather than in the ground, reduce the concentration slightly, maybe 3/4 of a tablespoon per gallon, because container soil has less volume to buffer any excess. Now let me explain why this works, because I promised you I would, and honestly, the science is what turned me from a skeptic into an evangelist. The core problem with struggling cucumber plants is almost always a pH issue in the root zone. Cucumbers prefer a soil pH between about 6 and 6.8, which is slightly acidic to neutral. When soil pH drifts outside that range, which it often does in garden beds that have been amended with compost, manure, or synthetic fertilizers over the years, the chemical reactions that make nutrients available to the plant simply stop happening. The nutrients are physically present in the soil, but they are chemically locked up in forms the roots cannot absorb. It is like having a bank account full of money, but no ATM card. You are rich in theory and broke in practice. Baking soda is mildly alkaline. When you dissolve it in water and pour it into the soil, it does exactly what it does in your refrigerator. It buffers. It neutralizes excess acidity, gently nudging the pH back toward the neutral range where nutrient availability is maximized. But it does something else that is even more important, and this is the part that misses. Kowalska explained to me in her kitchen that day. Baking soda, when it reacts with the organic acids naturally present in healthy soil, releases tiny amounts of carbon dioxide. Not enough to be dangerous, not enough to even see, but enough to create a slight effervescence in the microscopic spaces between soil particles. This gentle release of carbon dioxide does two things. First, it very slightly aerates the root zone, loosening compacted soil and giving roots better access to oxygen. Cucumber roots are notoriously intolerant of compacted, anaerobic soil. They suffocate easily. Second, that carbon dioxide dissolves into the soil moisture to form a very weak carbonic acid solution, which is one of nature's most gentle and effective mineral chelators. Chelation is the process of binding minerals into forms that plant roots can actually absorb. So in one simple application, you are correcting the pH, aerating the root zone, and making existing soil nutrients bioavailable, all with something you could safely eat by the spoonful. The soap plays a supporting role, as I mentioned, by ensuring the solution penetrates evenly, but it also has a subtle secondary benefit. The thin film it leaves on soil particles temporarily reduces the surface tension of water in the root zone, which means subsequent waterings penetrate more evenly for a few days after application. It is a tiny effect, but in gardening, tiny effects compound. I want to tell you what happened the first year I tried this, because I think it is important to set realistic expectations. I did not suddenly grow prize-winning cucumbers overnight. What I noticed, within about 4 days of the first application, was that the yellowing on the lower leaves stopped spreading. The plant did not magically turn deep green. It just stopped getting worse. That alone was enough to make me pay attention, because in my experience, once cucumber leaves start yellowing, they never stop. The decline just accelerates until the plant is dead. Stopping the decline is the first victory. By the end of the second week, after the second application, the new growth at the tips was coming in noticeably greener and more vigorous. The plant was not just surviving. It was finally starting to grow again. By week 3, the vines were putting out new flowers, and this time, the tiny cucumbers behind those flowers were not shriveling and dropping. They were swelling, slowly at first, and then with a kind of momentum that I had never seen in my own garden before. By week 5, I was harvesting more cucumbers than my family could eat, and that has been the pattern every year since. I should also mention that this is not just my own personal anecdote. The use of mild alkaline solutions to buffer soil pH is a practice that goes back centuries. Market gardeners in parts of Europe and Asia have long used dilute solutions of wood ash or lime water for the same purpose. Wood ash tea, which is basically water steeped with hardwood ashes, has a very similar pH buffering effect, though it is harder to dose precisely because the strength of wood ash varies dramatically depending on what wood was burned and how completely it combusted. Baking soda is consistent. A tablespoon is a tablespoon every time. That consistency is why I prefer it and why Mrs. Kowalska, who had been gardening for more than 40 years when I met her, had settled on it as her go-to after experimenting with ash, lime, and crushed eggshells over the decades. Now I need to give you a few cautions, because I am not here to sell you a miracle. I am here to tell you what actually works and what to watch out for. First, this method works best as a preventive or early intervention treatment. If your cucumber plant is already more than half yellow and has stopped growing entirely, it may be too far gone to save. You can try, and I have pulled a few plants back from the brink, but the earlier you catch the problem, the better your results will be. Second, this is not a fertilizer. Baking soda contains no nitrogen, no phosphorus, no potassium. It does not feed the plant directly. What it does is unlock the nutrients already in your soil, so the plant can feed itself. If your soil is genuinely depleted, if you have been growing heavy feeders in the same spot for years without adding compost or organic matter, then you need to address that underlying fertility issue as well. The baking soda solution will still help, but it is not a substitute for healthy soil. Think of it as the key that opens the pantry door. If the pantry is empty, opening the door does not help much. Third, and this is important, do not use this method on acid-loving plants. Blueberries, azaleas, rhododendrons, camellias, potatoes, and most evergreens prefer acidic soil and will not appreciate you raising the pH around their roots. This is specifically for plants that prefer neutral to slightly alkaline conditions. Cucumbers, tomatoes, squash, melons, beans, peas, broccoli, cabbage, and most common vegetable garden crops fall into this category. When in doubt, look up the preferred pH range for whatever you are growing. A quick search takes 30 seconds and can save you from doing the exact opposite of what your plant needs. Let me also address something that I know some of you are wondering about, because I wondered about it myself. Does the sodium in baking soda build up in the soil over time and cause problems? This is a legitimate concern, and I want to answer it honestly. Baking soda is sodium bicarbonate. It does contain sodium. However, the amount of sodium in 1 tablespoon of baking soda is about 1,200 milligrams. When you dissolve that in a gallon of water and apply it to several square feet of garden soil, the concentration is extremely low. Rain and irrigation water will flush most of it through the root zone over time. In my own garden, I have been using this method on the same beds for years, and I have had my soil tested by my local extension office. My sodium levels remain well within the normal range. The key is the once every 2-week schedule. Do not get enthusiastic and start applying it every other day. That would be a problem. Stick to the schedule, and the soil biology handles the rest. I want to circle back to something I said at the beginning about why you have probably never heard of this. It honestly kind of bothers me. Walk into any garden center and look at the fertilizer aisle. You will see bottles and bags with flashy labels and dramatic names, promising explosive growth and massive harvests, and they cost $15, $20, $30 each. The markup on those products is enormous, and the marketing budgets behind them are even larger. No one is going to spend millions of dollars on an advertising campaign to tell you to buy a box of baking soda for 99 cents. There is no profit in it. The information is not hidden in some grand conspiracy. It is just not profitable to promote. So it stays buried in old gardening books and passed down between neighbors like Mrs. Kowalska. While the shelves fill up with ever more expensive and complicated products that often address the symptoms rather than the cause. What I love about this method, and what I think you will love about it too, is that it puts the power back in your hands. You do not need to be a soil scientist. You do not need expensive equipment. You do not need to rely on a product that might be discontinued or reformulated next year. You just need to understand the simple chemistry of what your plan is asking for and give it that, using something you already have. That is the whole idea. Self-reliance, not brand loyalty. Understanding, not blind application. Before I wrap this up, let me give you a quick visual checklist so you know exactly when to apply. I look at my cucumber plants every morning when I walk through the garden with my coffee. It takes 30 seconds. I check the oldest leaves first, the ones closest to the ground. If I see the faintest hint of yellow creeping in from the edges, or if the leaves look a little dull and tired instead of vibrant and waxy, I make a mental note. If 2 or 3 leaves are showing that early warning sign, I mix up a gallon that evening and apply it the next morning. If only 1 leaf is affected, I might wait a few days and watch. Sometimes a single leaf yellows because it is old, and the plant is retiring it naturally. You learn to read the plant over time. The key is to catch the trend before it becomes a crisis. Yellowing that starts at the bottom and moves upward, especially if it is accompanied by slow growth and dropped fruit, is your signal to act. I also want to mention that this method works beautifully in conjunction with a good mulching practice. After I apply the baking soda solution, I make sure my cucumber beds have a 2 to 3 inch layer of straw or shredded leaf mulch. The mulch does several things. It keeps the soil moisture consistent, which cucumbers love. It suppresses weeds that would compete for nutrients. And it slowly breaks down, feeding the soil biology and adding organic matter over time. The baking soda solution works even better in a mulch bed, because the mulch buffers temperature and moisture swing that can stress the roots and trigger pH fluctuations. It is not required, but if you are not mulching your cucumbers, you are making things harder on yourself than they need to be. One more thing, and this is something I discovered entirely by accident a few years ago. If you are growing cucumbers in containers, which many people do on patios and balconies, this method is even more important. Container soil is a closed system. There is no deep mineral substrate to buffer pH changes, and the limited volume means that pH can swing wildly based on what you water with and how the plant is growing. Container cucumbers are notorious for yellowing and dropping fruit, often within weeks of looking healthy. I now treat my container cucumbers with the baking soda solution every 10 days instead of every 2 weeks, at the slightly reduced concentration I mentioned earlier, and the difference is night and day. My container plants now produce almost as well as my in-ground plants, which I used to think was impossible. So here is my challenge to you. If you have a cucumber plant that is struggling right now, or if you have given up on cucumbers entirely because they have never worked out for you, go to your kitchen, open the cabinet, take out that orange box, mix up a gallon, pour it on the roots, then wait. Give it 2 weeks. Give it 2 applications. Watch what happens to the new growth. Watch whether the yellowing stops. Watch whether the next round of tiny cucumbers actually hangs on and starts to swell. I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to try it and believe your own eyes. That is what I did, standing in my garden with a watering can full of something that cost me pocket change, feeling simultaneously hopeful and foolish. The hope won. The cucumbers won. And every year since, when I see those first yellow leaves appear, I do not panic. I just walk to the kitchen and I smile a little, because I know exactly what to do. Gardening is full of expensive solutions to simple problems. It is an industry that profits from your frustration, from your impulse to buy one more product that will finally fix everything. But the best solutions, the ones that have worked for generations, are almost always simple, cheap, and hiding in plain sight. Mrs. Kowalska passed this one to me. I am passing it to you. Use it, share it, and the next time you see a neighbor staring sadly at their yellowing cucumber vines, maybe you will be the one who says, "Come, I show you." If this helped you rethink what your plants actually need, go ahead and hit that like button so more gardeners can find this. Subscribe if you want more forgotten wisdom that actually works, no expensive products required. And if you try this on your own cucumbers, I genuinely want to hear what happens. Leave a comment in a few weeks and let me know. I read them, and I am always curious to see how these old methods perform in different gardens and different climates. Thanks for watching. Now go pour some baking soda on your cucumbers.